The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Frankly Speaking. I'm your host today, Frank Zaberick, and I'm kind of excited about today's show. Since about 2016 or so, I've had the executive director of a group called the Nathan Project. His name was Rick Cardos on here. And since then, I've had a couple of couples who are like facilitators in the Nathan Project group. They basically facilitate, they help in group therapy for people who are struggling with porn addiction or sex addiction. And I guess we'll talk about how they set up their meetings, whether it's a couple times a week or once a week, or how that works. But anyway, my guest today is a gentleman named Zach Ellis, and his official title is New Programs and Media Development Director for the Nathan Project.
That's correct.
Well, you're going to have to explain to us all, to my TV audience, what that's all about. So, Zach, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
And before I got a ton of questions here to ask you about, how the Nathan Project and how it operates and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And but before we do that, why don't you tell my TV audience a little bit about yourself, how you got involved with the Nathan Project, and also what the heck your title, New Programs and Media Development Director, is.
The longest title of all time.
I know. On this show, I think so.
Yeah, I'll hold that. Yeah, that's a good win for my book already. Longest title. That's good.
There you go.
Yeah, so a little bit about me,
Sure.
and kind of where I come from and what brought me into working within Nathan Project. So I am not a native New Englander. I was born and raised in the Midwest in northern Wisconsin, about an hour from Green Bay, if you know where that is. Green Bay Packers, cheese, all of that good stuff.
Okay.
And a little bit of context for there. So my father was and still is the executive director of a very large, well-established Christian camp and conference center there. And so I grew up kind of steeped in the soup of youth ministry and hosting and camping and that conversation that whole life. As I grew up, it was, I would say, a unique environment of being both known by many people, seen by many people within that environment, but not necessarily knowing all of the people that were coming. We're talking, 200-300 at least people per weekend of the year and week of the summer, year round. A lot of people in and out. And I'm on stage in many ways, or kind of hosting groups and in that type of position. And so you fast forward a little while. From that point forward, I went to a variety of schools. I thought I was going to go into medicine, realized I love working with people, not so much the sterile environment of the hospital system so much. Did a little bit of foreign travel, worked in Central America, doing some missions work, working with orphanages and schools. Came back from that, an internship with the camp, and kind of from that point forward realized really do love working with people and saw myself going into ministry of some kind. Went to Moody Bible Institute, which is in Chicago.
All right.
Yeah, well-known private Christian school, studied youth ministry with a minor in counseling then. I left that program and went immediately into working for a rather large church in central Wisconsin, so still out in the Midwest, as a youth pastor, junior high and senior high ministries for a year. And then resigned from that position, and we can get into any of these details here, but resigned from that position, and then after a short while came out to the New England area, 2017. At that point is when I met Rick Cardos through the Nathan Project. He's the director, founder, been running the whole ministry for, over 15 years now. And he and I have had personal relationship and a working relationship ever since. During all of that history and life, for me, right, that's kind of like the brief overview. Pornography use came into my life in, I would say, junior high, and slowly kind of built from there. Throughout my high school years, I experienced some sexual abuse, and then moving into later high school and into my college years, the pornography use, which was always hidden, nobody ever knew, nobody had been made aware of, I certainly wasn't making anybody aware, that compounded, I would say, in intensity over especially my later high school years and into early college, and was something that I continually went to even while studying at one of the more prestigious private Christian colleges and in preparation for ministry. So you can see the paradox, you can see the juxtaposition of somebody preparing to be a leader of people and yet deeply, deeply struggling and very much ill-prepared to be an example. And so that in large part, that problem, that addiction, hidden underneath the surface for many years was what brought me eventually into contact with Rick Cardos. You could say maybe by chance, but I don't necessarily say that. Maybe serendipitous is the better word. When I moved out to this area, I was in a pretty low place originally. I had resigned from my position at the church in large part because of that addiction really kind of coming to a head, me recognizing that I had just about nothing to actually give over to the people that I was supposed to be ministering to. I was in need of ministering to myself. And so when I moved out here, I had a short list of churches to check out, to get connected with. And the very first church on that list happened to be the one that Rick Cardos attended. With his keen eye for men who are in need, who are hurting, who are in the throes of either addiction or healing from it, he really kind of took me under his wing, introduced me to the groups that we now run, and maybe you'd say the rest is history, but history that we can get into.
So the testimony of like the couples I've had, well, there were married couples I had before, and I also had Rick Cardos. They all had, like Rick Cardos, I think, went through a divorce because the pornography, I guess his first wife, couldn't deal with it and stuff like that. So she just put in for a divorce and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And the other two couples are like, a silly millimeter away from divorce. But they found like the Rick Cardos' Nathan Project before that happened, thank God. In your testimony, however, you never really had like a girlfriend or wife to put you on, put pressure on you from that way. But there was enough pornography addiction there that you knew you had a problem there.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I would say that, no, I was never married, have never been married, and yet did date for extended periods of time, two different women in particular, and during those relationships, they were never, at least to my knowledge, aware of the problem, and yet they were most certainly affected by it. In some ways, even in a more dangerous way, right? You can imagine some of the gaslighting that can happen, whether intentional or unintentional, when somebody is struggling with an issue that puts strain on a relationship, certainly strain on communication, and yet the reason is never named or recognized. So it had profound effects on my relationships in very unhealthy ways. But it wasn't impacting in terms of marriage, right? I think, yeah.
Where others do. Okay, and one thing about this interview here, out of the between this and the other three I've had concerning the Nathan Project, I never had it. They've always had. Well, they've had for several years now, at least, not the past two because of the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. But before that, like I don't know, a dozen years or so, they've had a fundraiser at the Trinity Baptist Church in Nashua on 3 Lund Street. And they're going to have another one coming up on June 17th of this month. So that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Why don't you tell my audience a little bit about this fundraiser? First of all, they're charging like $35 per person. Mm-hmm. What are the expenses entailed by the Nathan Project?
Yeah, good question. So the majority expenses for the ministry, which operates as a nonprofit, are the covering of the executive director's salary. So that would be kind of common to just about every business and ministry situation. So that would be covering the founder, Rick Cardiff's salary, covering our office expenses, which would be rent, typical supplies, all the kind of mundane stuff that are required to at least have a space to go to stay out of the rain, like today. And then I think more specifically for our work, travel expenses. So there's a lot of, you think about the number of people that may be struggling with this issue, and yet, well, how do I get into contact with people in a way that can kind of soft sell opportunity to be made aware of the groups that we have, and so that requires a lot of travel. Oftentimes going to conferences. In particular, there's a men's conference called Iron Sharpens Iron, which meets nationally, and there's a lot of regional events for that. We actually have one coming up this upcoming Saturday based in Portland, Maine. But that would be one example of oftentimes us getting on the road, driving to a particular place, be it in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in New York, in Maine, in Massachusetts, speaking and giving a presentation on what the Nathan Project is and what we offer in a way that kind of expands the network of awareness to both churches, to individuals that attempt or that attend those conferences. So those would be some of the expenses that we have to cover, the real-time expenses, the gas that's involved, the meals, that kind of stuff, yeah.
Okay, and you're going to, other than yourself, you're going to have a Patrick Chen. He's with the in the Crossbridge Ministry of the Chinese Bible Church of Greater Boston. He's going to be a speaker. Now, is this guy an expert on sex addiction or porn addiction, or?
I wouldn't say expert, although I mean expert can kind of be, it's a hard term to nail down, right? But I would say he is knowledgeable in this work because of his involvement with FMO and then his work as a pastor as well, right? The pastoral work, bringing you into contact with people that are most often in a vulnerable place. And so the kind of honest, vulnerable conversation that happens that gives rise to a need to study, to become more informed. I know that that's certainly a part of his journey and his passion. So maybe in the pastoral sense and in the just general exposure to this issue over an extended period of time, there's expert level ability, certainly, yeah. And he has a really unique story of both involvement with FMO and now leading those groups, and specifically through the pandemic, having to kind of navigate both the in-person dynamic that I would say, and I think Rick and most people would say is much more effective and powerful, and the necessity of navigating virtual groups as well, and him having some pretty significant success in bridging that gap. So he'll be speaking to that.
And then we have, I assume these are facilitators out of New York, Dave and Lena Byron of Hudson Falls, New York.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so they have a very powerful testimony that they'll be sharing that night that really speaks to just the dynamic potential that is available, not just to them, but to anybody who is, I would say, humble and willing to put in the effort, to put in the work, and also the patience to stick with it over time. The resolution and the redemption of a marriage relationship and the impacts that has in so many broad-ranging ways on both their relationship, on their family. It's a powerful story, and so the whole night, the benefit itself, it's a fun opportunity. And when you ask about some of the costs that go along with it, it really speaks to the quality of event that we put on, where you say it's an opportunity for a date night in many ways, for networking, for enjoying company with people that are coming from all over the place. There's really, really good food, like extraordinarily good food that's provided. It's a fun event to be at. Certainly something that I think most of the people look forward to. Certainly not as an event that I have to go to, but I get to and look forward to going to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fascinating material mentioned there and also on your website, like comparing porn addiction to, let's say, cocaine addiction. Mm-hmm. I mean, or food addiction. It's amazing how much mentally, psychologically, they're all very, very similar. And it's very interesting to like compare the statistics.
And you're speaking specifically to porn use, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so and it is fascinating because this is new technology. The fMRI machines that are available to monitor live brain activity while any given substance or activity is being participated in, you can see the different parts of the brain that are lighting up. And what they've found is, while conducting these studies, that individuals who are utilizing cocaine versus those that are utilizing pornography, the same areas of the brain with the same level of intensity are lighting up, meaning it's essentially activating the same sensors, the same dopamine release, the same chemical high, but not in a way at all that we would expect, right? It's really, it speaks to the power and the kind of the nefarious power of pornography that we don't often really give credence to. So yeah, there's the new technology is pointing us in a direction that I think many have suspected, but this is confirming and really kind of concretizing how serious of an issue this is.
And then lastly, we have Vicky Cardos, who's Rick Cardos' wife. Now, the women have their own, like, women-only groups that, like, not necessarily like our wives trying to help out their husbands, trying to make sense out of what they're going through. But sometimes, I think, like, last year, there was, before the pandemic, I should say, there was a lady from Portland, Maine, who was dealing with sex addictions on her own, from her own personal life. So in these female ones, is it like mixed between the ones who are like wives or girlfriends just trying to make sense of what their significant others going through, or women themselves who are caught up in sex addiction of their own?
It's a good question, Frank. I think it goes both directions. I would say if we have to put them on a scale, the heavier side would lean towards the spouse, the betrayed spouse, the spouse that has experienced the trauma of a partner who is steeped in addiction. So it is, I would say, primarily ministering to and speaking to those women, although it is not at all exclusive to those women. There are certainly also individuals, women that are coming into the FWO or for women only groups who are experiencing sex addiction, pornography addiction, codependency as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I think that the bulk majority of women that come are more in that category of being affected by their spouse's addiction and really the comorbids that come from that, the extreme trauma of being with somebody who you both in some ways cannot trust, at least for a period of time, and yet are still living with, and having to navigate how do we rebuild a foundation that has in many ways eroded and dissolved away. It's a difficult journey to walk. So Vicky's work and her level of depth, and as we said before, her expertise is very real. As she's been doing this work for quite some time, has written her own curriculum that has developed from the work that she does with women. And it's powerful stuff. It's really, it's a 1-2 punch, I think, working with the men and working with the women.
Wow. And okay, so I mentioned earlier that I haven't seen the Nathan Project folks since before the pandemic. These had to be a very rough year for anybody dealing in porn or sex addiction. Since to quarantine yourself, I mean, you got stuck with either watching a lot of internet or a lot of TV, both unhealthy things for someone hooked up with. Would you say your numbers increased in some of the groups you've had, like locally in New Hampshire?
It's a good question again, Frank. I think, so there was an increase, I would say, in interest, although at the same time we experienced the complexity. That's why I say it's a complex issue where we experienced an increase in interest, but in many ways, some of those outlets that we would normally go to, like the conferences where it provides kind of a platform for men to be made aware of opportunity for healing within our groups, that was cut off during the pandemic where those gatherings weren't happening. So you see this really difficult tension between isolation and increased technology use, and then the lack of opportunity for gathering together in kind of the primary ways that we spread the word of what's available. So it's hard to know, really. I think that we probably maintain more or less steady numbers across the pandemic, but not for lack of increased need. It was a difficult position to be in. To your question and to your point, the pandemic really presented a unique increase in struggle for so many people because of what isolation does to us as human beings, right? And really, when we're talking about addiction in really any form, in so many ways, it almost always stems inherently from a lack of relationship, right? A lack of connection to other people, which we can choose in many ways, but in this case, the pandemic kind of forced the issue on that one. And so now that it just so profoundly, I think, highlights the unique and simple, profound, really benefit of these groups that we run, the FMO, for men only groups and for women only groups. The simplicity of gathering together and practicing honesty in community. I can't overstate that enough. Even just that phrase, practicing honesty in community, what that does, it's an incredible thing to be a part of and to see. You think like, well, you have to have experts, you have to have this complex curriculum, and we do have those things. We have material that we go through. We have experts that really have been trained in many ways to address these issues. But at the same time, the simplicity of gathering together to practice honesty, vulnerability, and come alongside of one another, it produces things that you would not ever expect, towards the good, towards the positive. It's pretty amazing.
One of the things, I think we talked a little bit about this off camera, that I find, even though like Rick Cardo's explained it to me, but the Nathan Project has a funny way of vetting people to have them first come down and start getting involved in groups. Mm-hmm. It's almost like you're looking, if you have like a business member or someone who dabbles in politics and saying, I know you're so-and-so and so-and-so. Mm. Do you try to go through like a vetting process of weeding those people out, and maybe if they want to talk, maybe go to another community where they're not so well known? Or why does the Nathan Project do that? Vetting them, to...
Yeah. No, again, it's a good question. I think, so as far as vetting goes, and if I'm understanding you correctly, the only vetting process maybe that we go through is maybe an attempt to clarify and to more clearly understand where each and any men who are interested in coming into a group, where they're coming from. Meaning, can we identify, is what they're dealing with in their life something that we can actually effectively attend to and be helpful with? Sometimes there are kind of comorbid issues that are presenting, whether it's depression or anxiety or a variety of things that might oftentimes certainly kind of live in tandem with sex addiction, but it's not always the case. So there are some qualifiers maybe that you would say for a guy to come in for us to be able to sit down, hear their story in a very personal, vulnerable, honest way, to just say, where are you coming from? What are the issues? What are the reasons why? This is not just everyday conversation to come and say, hey, I'm interested in joining a group that is specific to sex addiction recovery. There must be a good reason for why you're interested in this. So tell me about yourself, where you're coming from, what have you been dealing with, what's bringing you to this place? As far as the kind of guy or the position that he might be in, or the title that he might have, there's nothing exclusionary to anybody. We want to be as protective as possible if there is. So I would say any kind of vetting that we would do is in the interest of protecting the individual, so that they are both, they're being buttressed, given a foundation for security, for trust, because that's really the only kind of conditions in which healing occurs. The other piece of it, I think, is that, as you can imagine, even just in the simplicity of gathering people for a dinner party, a group of friends, in your mind, you're probably thinking of the personalities that you're bringing to the table and how they might interact with one another. That much more so in an FMO group, where as we've collectively agreed to gather together and be in support of one another, all of that is sitting on a foundation of honesty and vulnerability, probably at a depth that most people never experience in their life. Sharing the most intimate details of their life story as a necessity for getting to a place of understanding the whys underneath of what we do. And so that really, it cultivates a unique environment, a unique culture that when you bring in a new guy into that, there's really a need for commitment. That's really kind of the only admittance fee that we might have is, are you willing to be committed? Because as we have gotten to know each other and shared a lot of intimate details with our lives and committed to walk alongside of one another week by week, to bring another guy in, some of the literals, the tangibles that we have to do is kind of pause where we are in our curriculum and have every one of those guys reshare their story so that the new guy is brought up to speed with where we are all at. It's very much a maintaining of relationships. And then for him to be given the opportunity to introduce who he is so that he's brought into the fold, brought into the conversation rather than sitting on the sidelines and kind of slowly drifting his way in. It's very intentional. And so that's kind of part of that vetting process is wanting to know well that we can attend to those needs and then also respect the men that have really committed to doing this work together so that everybody is respected, honored, and committed to each other.
Yeah, it seems like if you're comparing the Nathan Project against Alcoholics Anonymous, I mean, granted, it's personal stuff if they've got into a habit where they're drinking too much and they just can't stop.
Sure.
But it's not as intimate and personal as your sexual fantasies and your quirks about that kind of stuff.
Right. I mean, talk about, this is a revealing of yourself in a way that almost never happens. And this, in its proper context, right, with your spouse, I think that there's a reason why, gosh, like it's a hard one to pick apart, but it's almost inherently obvious, the intimacy, the fragility of our sexuality. And so when you talk about bringing that into public conversation, all the more reason for why we talk about our FML groups as being a safe, closed, and confidential group, because I mean, it's necessary. And yet, at the same time, when that culture has been established, that safe space is recognized by everybody involved, the kind of work that can be done is extraordinary. I mean, it's a place where the kind of questions that almost everybody wants to ask but never gets the opportunity to can be asked. And so you imagine the type of learning, the type of growth, a light shining into what is otherwise almost always shadowy and dark and misunderstood can actually happen. It's pretty amazing.
When it was, it obviously had to be before the pandemic, so it was like 2019 or 2018. I had one of the couples either from Manchester or Portland, and one of them were telling me about, I don't know, call it like a computer networking partner up program, where I guess if you go on your computer, let's say I was married and my wife liked to shop on Victoria's Secret catalogs or Fredericks or Hollywood catalogs and buy like lingerie or, swimsuits and stuff like that. And we shared the same computer. That would go to like Min's computer, and they would call somebody like me up and saying, we just got a warning here that your computer went on Fredericks or Hollywood and Victoria's Secrets. And, then in that case, you say, well, that's my wife's thing. But you must have heard about that. I don't know what they call it.
Like the accountability kind of programs or software? Yes. Oh, certainly. Yeah. And that's, so two of the kind of the most primary, the well-known software programs are called Covenant Eyes. And then,
it.
Covenant Eyes and then Accountable to You. And they really do serve as some powerful tools in our arsenal. And so I would say to your question, it's kind of a multi-leveled question. First, that tool set of accountability, what we do is in partnership with other men, right? So that it's not creating a strain between you and your spouse, right? Really, in so many ways, the spousal relationship is not built to be keeping accountability over one another. It places an unnecessary pressure and I think an unhealthy dynamic of responsibility onto the spouse that really is why we have our FML groups. It's not at all to hide anything, but it's to be able to offload and depressurize that conversation from husband and wife so that the husband is still receiving that accountability from the fellow men in his group so that he can become healthy with his wife rather than her taking on this additional responsibility of both loving and being intimate with, but then also having to watch and kind of, it's not something that, as you can imagine, it's divisive. So
if you're tempted to say, mind your own damn business and hang up the phone instead of engaging with somebody like that. But if you're in that problem, you're in that addiction, you say, well, I know I got a problem. I got to do something about it.
Right. And so those programs, that software, both Covenant Eyes and Accountable to You, what it does is it provides an insight from a guy or multiple guys that you've given permission to, access to, view what you are looking at on your computer, so that not necessarily in a way that controls what you do, but in some ways it does end up, it allows for a second guessing of whatever your behavior might be, to know, okay, well, if I actually don't want to be exposing myself to pornography, as if it is a dangerous thing, and in this context we're talking about it as a dangerous thing, as a drug in so many ways that will bring harm to your life. If that's how we're looking at this, then I do actually want to make a potential danger known to those in my life that care about me and that I trust, so that we can operate as a team, as a unit. This is something where I have agreed to that I don't want this in my life, and yet it's so likely that I will be exposed to it somehow, or will at some point choose to go and seek it out. And so to put up defenses for that without limiting myself to any and all computer use, which in today's modern age is pretty difficult to do, that would put some probably untenable parameters on your life. So it's finding a middle ground between those. And in that finding of a middle ground, that's coming from inviting yourself and others into participatory community. It's dissolving isolation. It's saying, I desire for this and I need your partnership in it. And because of that, we actually have that much more reason for relationship, for conversation. So I think it's a really good thing. It's easy to look at it in such a restrictive, kind of constrictive manner, that I'm having to put myself in this cage or put these parameters on me. But really, it's actually inviting for partnership and for relationship that actually helps to avoid a danger.
Do you have Covenant Eyes on your computer?
Yes.
And have your friends, other members of Nathan Project, call you up and say, there's something funny on your computer?
Right, they have that opportunity, yes. So they're able to see the searches that I make, whatever it is that I'm looking at on my computer, and if there's something that comes up that seems suspicious, not only do they have the permission, but they are expected to be calling me up to say, hey, we care about you, we've made a commitment together, and this looks a little dicey. So, and to your question as regards to the spouse, I think the hope, I don't want to say expectation, but the hope would be that in regards to Victoria's Secret or Fredericks of Hollywood or any of those things, that if she is aware of the problem, then there are probably alternative means to be making purchases like that, right? So that hopefully she would at least be on the same team in promotion of her husband's health, to say, hey, maybe I'll just go to the mall and make this purchase in person and not bring about any unnecessary temptation.
Amen.
Yeah.
Okay, another thing. I don't know if you guys do this, but I heard, a minister who just passed away. I don't know if you're into TV ministries, Daystar.
I'm not
Marcus
familiar.
Lamb, okay. Well, Marcus Lamb from Dallas, Texas. In fact, he just passed away this past Christmas on COVID. They're also anti-vaxxers, him and his wife. But 5 or 6 years prior to him passing away from COVID, I guess he had an affair for 6 or 7 years. And one of the things he agreed to do, which I guess if you're in a situation like that and you want to make up with your wife, you've got to make some, strong commitments, or you're going to be in trouble. But he said that after that, now if he goes on the computer, he'll never have it in his office or his bedroom and where he shuts the door. Right now, if he goes on Facebook or something like that, he'll be right in the living room on a laptop. And the passwords, he'll have all his passwords there that his wife or kids, if they want to look through them, they can.
Sure.
I guess if I was in that situation and I needed to do something to save my marriage, I would do that, but that's a strong commitment to do it in the open. But I would assume that a lot of it, I mean, a lot of the porn addiction and sex addiction is done in private. Like if you're at your employer, you're going to make darn sure that, your boss or none of your colleagues are looking at you and, walk in on you when you're in the middle of something.
Right.
So do you strongly recommend that for your members?
That meaning?
That if you're going to be on a computer on the internet, do it in the open as much as possible. And with your real spouses or something, not necessarily your kids, but especially your spouses or your girlfriends, to have, your passwords there and have it in the open and not hit a button on your computer to get off the screen on whatever the heck you're on.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's a multi-layered question maybe. I think that there's a season for everything. In the midst of addiction, and certainly the early stages of healing, of coming out of addiction and into recovery and hopefully eventually restoration, there probably will be a season where total exposure of any access point that you might have is going to be necessary. I know for myself personally and for just about every guy that I've had in conversation who has experienced this problem, there is a period of time in which you really cannot trust yourself, and so trust has to be brought in through the form of access to those that you love, right? And that's where some of the complexity comes in, where there isn't a placing of undue pressure onto a spouse or onto family members, where there's multiple layers to that relationship. That's why in so many ways the necessity of a group like our FMO groups comes into the mix to say, now you have accountability with men who know your story, who understand the problem, so they can speak the same language, and they also know the tricks that we often play on ourselves and can play on others to go, oh, I know what that smells like. No, you're not pulling one over on me, because if our goal is actually towards health, then gosh, the variety of methods that we can come up with to get our fix, if we're talking about this as a drug, which it is, those will come up. And so even it may be in the beginning where you say, I don't want anything to do with this addiction anymore. It has potentially cost me my marriage, my job, my mental sanity, my ability to focus, my ability to be present, any of those things. And those things all happen if that's the case. And yet, very shortly thereafter, the patterns that have been set up over time and well-worn pathways in the brain to be craving for that dopamine release, for that chemical fix, are still there. And so against your better judgment, gosh, you better believe there's going to be attempts made to get that fix again, even against the commitments that you've made. And so we put things into place, safeguards, if you want to call them that, to help negate some of that for that early season of time, so that resiliency is built up in the midst of community, so that we can actually remain on a trajectory towards restoration.
Okay.
It's a complex thing, yeah.
Okay, so there are probably some people watching this telecast right now, or maybe over the internet, and looking at you and then saying, this Zach Ellis is going to be one of the biggest liars on the face of the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, you're nothing, they'll look at you as nothing but a red-blooded, all-American boy with strong sexual desires. Mm-hmm. What separates yourself, what separates like a porn addict or a sex addict from being an all-American boy with strong sexual desires?
Sure. Yeah. It's a good question, right? Yeah, because in so many ways we think the pendulum swing can go from one extreme to another, to say, well, if I have, and in some ways it's necessary to define addiction. I actually had to in terms of addiction, to give that some sense of definition, we're talking about compulsive behavior, right? That I can no longer, quote unquote, control. That can manifest in all sorts of ways, right? That can be food, that can be alcohol, that can be drugs, that can be shopping and making purchases, that can show up in all sorts of ways. So the definition for addiction can be a hard one to pin down, but I think really it does come up with, it's well described with a compulsive behavior that is bringing negative or damaging effects into your life that you are no longer in control of. So it is now controlling you. Whether you want it to or not, it has taken over. It has its hands on in the driver's seat on the wheel. And so the difference between that and maybe we say red-blooded American with strong sexual desires, I think I think if we put it into the context of being a created being, then there is a right place for healthy relationship for all of that desire to be channeled, not just for men, but for women as well, right? This goes both ways, that we are built for sexuality, we are built for sexual expression, but I think in a particular context, in the context of marriage, in the context of committed relationship, which really is embodying trust, is embodying faithfulness, is embodying dedication that transcends the ups and downs of any given season, right? That is where healthy sexuality thrives, within that safe container. And it doesn't come without hardships. It doesn't come without commitment, without, again, patience, steadfastness, perseverance, that our culture really doesn't speak to hardly at all anymore. It's like, well, if we want to simplify it down, so much of the way that we talk about sexuality nowadays is I want to have the cake without having to do anything else around. I don't even want to think about baking it, putting the work in. I just give me the high, give me the frosting even. I don't even want anything else underneath of it. And in reality, does it work that way? No. I don't think so. So red-blooded desire, all of that, I think that is not at all something that we say we turn off, that we avoid, that we say isn't a possibility, but it's potentiating all of that within a proper context. Otherwise, the dangers most certainly become, when we talk about sex addiction, pornography addiction, this is me-focused, this is self-focused, this is immediate gratification without any of the work, without any of the relationship. And boy, is that enticing, because in some ways you're telling yourself, I can have all of the good things without having to put the work in. And yet I think anybody who's lived for any amount of time and has gleaned some wisdom knows that that we don't get any of the good things in life without the hard work that comes up underneath of it.
Amen.
So yeah, I don't know, does that answer the question?
It does.
Okay.
It does. Speaking about amen, now, when I first met Rick Cardos in 2016, I met him out of a Christian music festival local here. And he had told me that he's like a minister in Goffstown. And you mentioned that you were like a youth minister in Wisconsin and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So is Nathan Project like a Christian, based on a Christian beliefs and principles?
It is, yes.
So do you minister to like Jews, Buddhists, atheists, Muslims, or anybody who has, struggling with sexual porn addiction or in that genre?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question, Frank. And yes, we do. So I would describe it for our FMO and FWO groups as very much inclusive rather than exclusive. So the men that would come to us that are presenting with an issue of sexual addiction, pornography addiction, that want help, they can expect to experience specifically Christian language, Christ-focused language within our groups. And yet there is no exclusivity to who can join. And I would say that much more so, there is an open invitation to those that are struggling with this issue, and an invitation to say, well, we're going to be operating under the assumption that we are created beings by God, and that Jesus Christ is our unique Savior that brings about redemption, actual true redemption to our lives. And so that's the model that we operate within. But it is not to say that anybody coming from a different background, a different faith paradigm, we are not saying that they are not welcome by any means. And in many ways, some of the aspects of those faith traditions, they bring in, I would say, another thread to the unique tapestry of humanity that informs a more dynamic conversation within our groups. It is different than an anonymous group, like an Alcoholics Anonymous, where the language is intentionally made more ambiguous. We don't operate with ambiguous language like. So that's to that point. We're talking specifically about God, about Jesus, about Scripture, and how that informs what we believe to be. A path towards the actual restoration and healing that we desire.
If I was an atheist, Muslim, or Jew, or something like that, Buddhist, and I had a sex addiction, I knew I had a problem, I knew I had to do something, I would say, what the heck, I might as well go to a Christian group like the Nathan Project, and, do the best I possibly can to get out of this living hell I'm going through. Have you ever had people where individuals were saying that, like, go into a therapy group like that, suck all the oxygen about telling their own testimonies and stuff like that? It's the end of the world for them. And you say to them lovingly, maybe to the side, saying, maybe group therapy like this isn't working out for you. Maybe you should go to like a psychologist or psychiatrist instead.
It's a good question, Frank, and an insightful one, right? It's like almost like you have an insight into some of the dynamics that we have, because that can happen. And I think in part, it's because if that is to happen, that kind of sucking the air out of a room or dominating a lot of time, that I think the reasons for why that can happen is because so often this is the first time that conversation like this has really ever happened for so many of the men, and myself included, where like I don't want to say that it's applicable to every guy, but so often you see kind of an initial nervousness in maybe the first, second, maybe even third meeting, FMO meeting that a guy might come to, where they're more quiet, observant, really kind of feeling out how much can I trust in the honesty, the vulnerability, the support, the confidentiality that this group is going to offer. But when that clicks and the guy realizes, oh, this is a safe place where I can actually express and purge out so many of the thoughts, feelings, questions, doubts, fears, insecurities that are very much tangled up inside of me, that can initially result in a lot of conversation, a potential maybe sucking some of the air out of the room. But it's also what's unique about FMO groups is that in contrast to an anonymous group where crosstalk is very much discouraged, in our case, maybe crosstalk isn't encouraged, but we allow for open dialogue. So if you were to share your story or something that happened during your week, I can jump in and say, hey, that brought a thought to mind. I have a mutual experience that I think might speak to that. Like, we're doing life alongside of each other in those groups. So there are also, to the other portion of your question, oftentimes opportunities, I think, that really do benefit from a guy who's coming into an FMO group who will also be actively participating in counseling of some kind outside of our group. And we have counselors that we refer people to, both psychologists and psychiatrists. So sometimes there's a medication component that comes in. Oftentimes, I would say, if available in both time and resources for a guy to be in one-on-one counseling in tandem with FMO, we're always in promotion of that. Because it becomes kind of, like we said before, this 1-2 punch of really effective and strategic healing when you can have both of those pieces coming together. And right now, in the groups that I'm both involved with and helping to lead, we have both of those dynamics happening. Some guys that are only attending FMO, and some guys that are both attending FMO groups and in active relationship with a counselor and with a psychiatrist working with medication, trying to hit it from all angles.
I see. Okay, so one group that a support group that I was involved with a few years ago, and well, support groups are like support groups. I mean, they have a lot of common denominators. And well, this particular group was a divorce and separation group that when I first got divorced in the late 90s, first part of this century. And anywho, the facilitator was a Church of Christ. She was a Church of Christ minister. And there was like men and women who either, separated, going through a divorce or what have you. And she would strongly encourage that the men and women don't date until they, quote unquote, become healthy and figure out why exactly they're going through a divorce or a separation in the first place. And it's not always your ex. You're getting in those groups and you say, my ex did this, my ex did that. Sometimes you got to humble yourself and say, a lot of this could have been my fault too. Yeah. So, and she says, basically to, come to this support group for like, several months, maybe several years, figure out what you did wrong and where do you go from here before you start dating like females in the group. Do you, I don't know if it's the same thing with a porn addiction or sex addiction, well, guys who aren't married, the single guys, to maybe a 10-year group for like 6 months or so to maybe a couple of years before they figure out they're healthy enough to go into a strong relationship with the opposite sex.
Yeah, it's a good question, and again, and a complex one, Frank. I think for every person, if we assume that every person is both unique and individual, and at the same time likely manifesting similar issues, right? If we're being honest, then maybe the clearest answer to that question, the most concise, might be that healthy people make healthy decisions. And so the journey to becoming healthy, although varied and unique, there's patterns that I think are observable, especially when you're in a situation with a group of men and you're seeing the varying stages of health coming out of an addiction. It becomes kind of apparent when somebody is both outward focused enough, meaning other-centric, and at the same time self-aware enough to be in a healthy relationship. The amount of time that it takes to get there, gosh, that's going to be different for every guy. But when somebody gets to that place or begins to be in that place, the demeanor that they have, the countenance that they have, the energy level, the motivation, the clarity, the empathy, the patience, all of that really starts to become apparent. And so it's exciting to see when men and women are able to get to that place. But you're right, there definitely is a season of time where it is necessary to not be distracted and self-distracted by the demands of a relationship so that the internal issues that are most certainly there can be explored without that distraction. It's so easy to offload energy to say, boy, looking at my own stuff is kind of painful. It's kind of uncomfortable. I'd rather just get preoccupied with something else. And then most likely, if not 100% for sure, those same issues that caused the problem are going to come up in this other relationship again, and the problem and the cycle will repeat. So there needs to be a hard break at some point, but not perpetually, right? And I think that's often the question underneath of there that's being asked is, how long do I need to be single? How long do I need to be working on my stuff? And maybe that period of time is not as long as people might think, but the intensity and the focus, the level of focus needed for that season of time is a necessary one, I think.
Yeah. Amen. Okay, a couple of quick points. Okay, when I first took Psychology 101, one of my first college courses, and I was in the Air Force at the time, and my professor was an Air Force captain who was a psychiatrist, I guess, and he had mentioned something that was unbelievable, that saying that you would qualify an affair, a quote-unquote affair, not necessarily with, you cheating on your wife or your wife cheating on you, but your time with the internet, spending like all night or so when you should be like in bed, talking sweet nothings with your spouse or something like that. You're on the internet speaking sweet nothings with, the girl from Fredericks of Hollywood, or something, or
sure,
even worse on some of those porn movies. So, would you consider that an affair?
I think, it's again, we've got good questions, Frank. I would say, to answer that question, it's going to demand that we have a worldview, that informs how we answer that question. And in my case, and in the case of, I think I can speak on behalf of Rick Cardos and the Nathan Project, the perspective that we take, that would be qualified as what you might say is virtual adultery. So if we're talking about how we define relationship, meaning commitment to another person, meaning exclusivity in relationship to another person, and that there are elements of that relationship that we regard as sacred, meaning to be uniquely shared with that other person and no one else, then gosh, it sure seems like through pornography use that sacred element, that exclusivity is now being shared with another. Even if that person isn't in the flesh with you, there is a relationship that is being formed with that image, with that person, with the viewing of that act that most certainly is creating a rift between, even if we just look at, like you said, the amount of time that's being spent in a relationship. I could certainly point to the necessity of time that is shared, and hopefully not just in demand only, but in desire to be spending time with. And if I'm giving that over to something else that is taking from, you're playing with messy, you're swimming in dark waters, certainly.
Wow. Well, time flies when you're having fun, eh, Zach?
Yes.
My director told me we have, just about 3 minutes left. Is there anything we discussed here that you'd like to elaborate on real quick, or something we have not discussed yet that you'd like to bring up at this time?
I think we covered a lot of ground, and I hope that as we're talking through some of these things, that it doesn't come across as too formal of language. When within our FMO groups, I can't stress enough how personal and relational the feel is when anybody is entering into these groups. It's dynamic relationship, it's conversation that both lives within our weekly meetings and outside of them, where we're in contact with each other. Part of our groups is the necessity of making phone calls and being an active support of each other out in the world in our regular everyday lives. I just see it as a really unique, powerful, sharp tool in our tool set for combating and navigating a pretty complex issue that seems to only be increasing in intensity and getting younger and younger as well. So I say with a lot of excitement that we have a unique opportunity through these groups. And as far as the fundraiser, the benefit goes?
Yes, the 17th, Friday
yes.
the 17th of June.
Yes, the 17th of June, 6:30 to 9 at Trinity Baptist Church in Nashua. It's going to be a really great time. Lots of good food, good fellowship, conversation, hearing some powerful stories. We just love to see people come out for it.
Yeah. And if you're watching this on, let's say, the internet, and June 17th of 2022 is ancient history, I would say contact nathanproject.net.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And, you'll either talk with Rick Cardos or Zach. Mm-hmm. And they could, if, you have an individual, yourself or a friend of yours is going through some, struggling with some of these issues, that might be a good communications tool to get in touch with.
Very much so. Yeah, we are privileged with the opportunity to be available for phone calls. We're receiving phone calls from people all over, especially within this region, working with just about anybody that has a need and has reached out. So via email, certainly via phone call, never hesitate to be reaching out, because that's what we're here for.
Is the Nathan Project New England region or nationally?
So we're focused primarily in the New England region, but we are working with people all over the country.
Like New York?
Yes, like New York. We just worked with some people from Ohio, people in California, Illinois, all over the place.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this has been a blessing to you, ladies and gentlemen. Please contact nathanproject.net, mm-hmm. and they'll lead you to the right paths, I'm sure. And for then, till next time, ladies and gentlemen, join me next time on Frankly Speaking. Thank you very much.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.